If you had walked through Hungerford on the morning of 19th August 1987, nothing about it would have stood out to you. It was a quiet English town, the kind of place where people followed familiar routines, where neighbors recognized each other, and where serious violence simply wasn't part of daily life. But over the course of that day, something happened. Something that would completely change how the town was seen and remembered. A 27-year-old man using firearms he legally owned at the time moved through Hungerford and surrounding area. By the time it was over, 16 people have been killed and 15 others have been seriously injured before he took his own life. What made the case especially difficult to understand was that despite a detailed investigation and an official Home Office inquiry, no firm motive was ever established. The inquiry went on to examine not only the events themselves, but also how emergency services responded. It found that officers on the ground acted with courage, but they were dealing with limited staffing, overwhelmed telephone lines, and communication systems that were not designed for an incident on that scale. The events in Hungerford would go on to influence major changes in how incidents like this are handled in the UK and in how firearms are regulated. But before any of that was fully understood, there was simply the reality of what happened that day and the impact it had on a town that had never experienced anything like it before. This is what happened. To understand what happened, it helps to start with the place itself. Hungerford sits in Berkshire, in the south of England. It is a small market town surrounded by countryside, with the Kenneth and Avon Canal running through it. Before 1987, Hungerford was better known for antique shops and a close-knit community. It was the kind of place where people recognized each other, where routines were familiar, and where incidents of this scale simply did not happen. The man responsible was Michael Ryan. He was 27 years old and lived with his mother, Dorothy, on South View. It is a residential street on the edge of the town. By that point in his life, he had worked a number of manual jobs, but in 1987, he was unemployed and spent most of his time at home. He held both firearms and shotgun certificates issued by Thames Valley Police, and he owned several weapons legally under the Firearms Act of 1968. There was no record of a previous conviction for violence. In fact, the only known prior contact he had with police was for a speeding offense. Over the years, there has been a lot of discussion about his mental state. Different interpretations have been suggested, but there is no formal psychiatric diagnosis recorded in the public record, and no court ever heard expert evidence about his condition. So, while there are theories, there is nothing that has ever been confirmed in a way that fully explains what would happen next. And that lack of clarity would become one of the most difficult parts of this case. On the morning of Wednesday, 19th August, Ryan left his home in Hungerford with firearms and ammunition in his car. At that point, nothing had been reported, and there was no indication of what was about to unfold. Shortly after midday, he drove about 7 miles west, crossing into neighboring Wiltshire until he reached Savernake Forest. It was there that the first known attack took place. According to the reconstruction used in the official inquiry and later BBC reporting, at around 12:30 p.m., he approached 35-year-old Susan Godfrey, who was out on a picnic with his 2 young children. What followed is based on those reconstructions. He forced her away from her children at gunpoint and shot her multiple times. Her children were able to escape and raise the alarm. This was the first confirmed killing of the day. From there, Ryan left the forest and headed back towards Hungerford. As he drove along the A4, he fired at passing motorists, with further shootings reported near the Golden Arrow service station. By this point, the situation was no longer isolated, and it was beginning to spread across multiple locations. Shortly before 12:45, Ryan returned to Hungerford and drove back into Southview, the street where he lived. According to the official report, he set fire to his own house and then to his car outside. He also shot and killed the family dog. The smoke drew attention from neighbors, and people began to come outside to see what was happening. As they did, Ryan started firing in the streets, shooting at people in doorways and gardens and at passing cars. Among those killed at this stage was his mother, Dorothy, who he shot near their home. As he moved away from Southview, the report records that he continued firing, wounding several neighbors, including people who were trying to help those already injured. By around 12:40, emergency calls were beginning to reach Thames Valley Police. The first reports mentioned a shooting at the Golden Arrow service station, and then further calls came in from Hungerford itself. Officers responded in unarmed patrol cars, still working with limited information and not yet aware of the full scale of what was unfolding. When PC Roger Brereton, an unarmed traffic officer, drove into Priory Road in his marked vehicle, Ryan opened fire. Brereton was killed while still in his seat. Along the same road, Ryan forced his way into the home of Jack and Myrtle Gibbs. Jack was killed at the scene, and Myrtle was critically injured and later died in hospital. Events in Hungerford itself took place over a relatively short period. Police accounts placed the first shooting in the town at around 12:47 and the last around 1:45. That is just under an hour of sustained violence within the town. When viewed along the earlier attack in Savernake Forest and what followed later in the day, it forms part of a much longer sequence of events that stretched into the evening. But within Hungerford itself, this was the period when the situation escalated most rapidly, and when the impact on the community was at its most immediate. As armed officers and additional units began to arrive in Hungerford, Ryan made his way toward John O'Gunt's school. At the time, the school was closed for the summer holidays. He entered the buildings and remained inside, at times firing from the windows. By this stage, police had set up a firearms cordon around the area. The decision was made to contain him rather than enter the building immediately, partly because of the risk that he might leave and move toward other parts of the town. During this time, there was some limited communication with him using a telephone and a loudhailer. Accounts from the official report and later BBC coverage suggest that at one point he expressed regret about killing his mother and the family dog. As the afternoon moved into the evening, the situation remained contained within the school. At some point later that day, Ryan died inside the building from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Because he died at the scene, there was no criminal trial, and no court ever examined his action in detail. No formal judgment was made about his mental state or his motive. So while the events of that day were extensively investigated, some of the most important questions about why it happened were never fully answered. In the days that followed, attention turned to what had happened and how it had been handled. Home Secretary Douglas Hurd commissioned an inquiry led by Colin Smith, the Chief Constable of Thames Valley Police, to examine both the shootings and the emergency response. The report confirmed the scale of the incident. 16 people had been killed and 15 others had been injured. It also confirmed that the weapons Ryan used were legally owned and had been properly recorded under the firearms laws in place at the time. A significant part of the inquiry focused on how police and emergency services responded. It found that local staffing levels were limited and that the first wave of emergency calls created confusion as information came in from multiple locations. Communication systems were quickly overwhelmed, and officers on the ground were working with equipment that had not been designed for an incident of this scale. Despite those limitations, the report noted that officers responded with courage in extremely difficult circumstances. When it came to Ryan himself, the inquiry was cautious. It revealed what was known about his background, but it did not reach a clear conclusion about why he carried out the attacks. No firm motive was established, and the report did not provide a formal psychiatric diagnosis. So, while the inquiry answered many of the practical questions about how the incident unfolded, it left the central question largely unresolved. In the years that followed, Hungerford had to find a way to live with what had happened. For many people in the town, it became about finding a balance, remembering what happened while still trying to move forward. Some residents and survivors later described it as a kind of reluctant remembrance. It's not something they wanted to revisit often, but also not something they could ever fully ignore. The anniversaries were marked quietly and with care. For the 25th anniversary in 2012, the town chose not to hold a large public memorial service. By the 30th anniversary in 2017, there was a church service and a minute's silence. But even then, local leaders were clear that Hungerford should not be defined only by what happened in 1987. And that tension has remained. For those who lived through it, and for those who came after, the events of that day are part of the town's history, but not the whole of it. One of the reasons the events in Hungerford are still discussed is because of what followed. At the time, the weapons Ryan used were legally owned, and the inquiry highlighted how those firearms made it possible for him to cause a large number of casualties in a relatively short space of time. That became part of a wider discussion about firearms laws in the UK. In 1988, the government introduced the Firearms Amendment Act. The legislation banned most semi-automatic center fire rifles and introduced tighter controls on certain types of shotguns. Alongside those changes, a firearm amnesty was carried out, during which tens of thousands of weapons and large amounts of ammunition were handed in. These changes did not come immediately on the day, but they are often traced back to Hungerford as one of the events that led to a shift in how firearms are regulated. So, while the incident itself ended in 1987, its effects continued in the years that followed, not only in how the event was remembered, but in how policy was shaped. Even with the level of detail in the inquiry, there are still parts of this case that have never been fully explained. The first is motive. The report looked at Ryan's background, but it did not identify a clear reason for why he carried out the attacks. There was no single event that could be pointed to, and no statement left behind that set out his intentions. The second is his mental state. Over time, different interpretations have been offered. Some have described him as severely mentally ill, while others have pointed to a combination of isolation and personal grievances. But because he died on the day, there was no trial and no formal diagnosis was ever examined in court. There are also differences in how the timeline is described. Police accounts focus on the period inside Hungerford itself, which lasted just under an hour between the first and last fatal shooting in the town. Media coverage often refers to a much longer time frame, counting from the first attack in Savernake Forest through to his death later that day. Both descriptions are accurate, but they reflect different ways of understanding the scale of what happened. And that is part of what makes this case difficult to fully resolve. A lot is known about how it unfolded, but some of the most important questions have never had clear answers. What happened in Hungerford in 1987 is still remembered today, and for many, it always will be. For the people who lost family, friends, and neighbors, this was never just a case. It is something personal, something that doesn't really fade with time. Over the years, the town has found ways to acknowledge what happened while still moving forward. People still live here. They work, raise families, and carry on, holding both the memory of that day and everything that came after it. Even now, there are parts of this case that were never fully explained. The facts are known, but the reasons are not. And that uncertainty has stayed with this story from the very beginning. What remains are the lives that were lost, the families forever affected, and a community forced to find a way forward after something it never saw coming. You can follow what happened step by step. You can understand how it unfolded, but understanding why it happened is where the answers run out. This is Criminal Cadence. Like, share, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this.